The house was gone. The truck was gone. The savings account, the one he had built dollar by dollar over 31 years, was gone. What remained of Walter Briggs's life fit into the back seat of a borrowed Ford, and a dog crate bungee corded to the trunk. Rex didn't make a sound the whole drive. He just pressed his nose against the metal grate and watched Walter with those quiet amber eyes the way dogs do when they understand something that hasn't been said out loud yet. Walter was 64 years old. He had done 2 tours in Vietnam and 1 in the Gulf. He had buried his father, his mother, and a fellow sergeant named Dickie Calhoun, who used to hum Merle Haggard while he cleaned his rifle. He had survived things that had no business being survived. But sitting in that parking lot outside the courthouse in Baton Rouge, watching his daughter-in-law's attorney walk to a silver Mercedes with a leather briefcase and 0 visible remorse, Walter Briggs felt something he hadn't felt since he was 19 years old and soaking wet in a rice field outside Da Nang. He felt completely alone. It hadn't always been like this. There was a time, not so long ago, it seemed, when Sunday dinners happened at a table big enough for 12 people. When his son Marcus called just to talk, when the grandkids left crayon drawings on the refrigerator door. There was a time when Walter believed that the things you built with your hands and your discipline and your sacrifice were yours to keep. His son had married a woman named Renee 8 years ago. Walter had stood at the back of the church in his dress uniform and told himself he was happy. He had tried. He had given them the down payment on the house in Metairie. He had watched the grandchildren on weekends so they could have date nights. He had never once said the things he was thinking. It hadn't mattered. When Marcus's business collapsed 2 years ago, a landscaping company that bled out slowly the way most small businesses do, not in one catastrophic moment but in 100 small ones, Renee had filed for divorce within 6 months. She had taken the house. She had taken the car. She had taken the children to her mother's place in Shreveport, and the calls from Marcus had gone from weekly to monthly to almost never. And somehow, Walter still wasn't entirely sure how the legal machinery had done it, only that it had. The money he had loaned Marcus for the business had been reclassified as a gift, and the property he had co-signed on had been folded into the settlement. And when the judge's gavel came down, Walter Briggs walked out of that courthouse with less than he had brought back from Southeast Asia in 1971. He drove north out of Baton Rouge with no particular destination in mind. Rex slept in the back seat somewhere around Natchitoches, his big head resting on his paws, and Walter turned the radio on low and let old country music fill the silence. He didn't decide to go to Calhoun County until he passed the exit sign and felt his hands turn the wheel before his mind had agreed to it. His father's land. 63 acres of pine forest and red clay soil in the northwest corner of Louisiana, up near the Arkansas line. The kind of place that barely showed up on maps. His father, Earl Briggs, had bought it in 1958 for back taxes and spent 30 years clearing the south field by hand, cutting timber, running a few head of cattle. He had died there in 2009, and Walter had driven up for the funeral, and then driven back to Baton Rouge because there was nothing left to stay for. He hadn't been back since. The road that turned off Highway 171 had once been gravel. Now it was something less than that. 2 dirt tracks pressed into the pine needles, barely wide enough for the car, overhung on both sides with brush that scraped against the mirrors. Walter kept driving. Rex stood up in the back seat and put his nose to the crack in the window, reading something in the air that Walter couldn't detect. The farmhouse came into view around a long bend in the track, and Walter stopped the car and sat there for a moment without speaking. It was still standing. That was more than he had expected. The porch had partially collapsed on the left side, the boards black with rot, sagging toward the ground like a shoulder, giving out under too much weight. The tin roof had gone orange with rust. The front window was cracked in a long diagonal line from corner to corner, and the screen door had come off its upper hinge and leaned against the frame at an angle, banging softly in the October wind. But the walls were solid. The stone chimney that his father had built by hand from creek rock was intact. And through the cracked windshield, in the flat gray afternoon light, Walter thought he could see the woodpile, or what was left of it, stacked along the east side of the house under a rusted metal lean-to. His father had always stacked wood early. "Start in August," he used to say. "The cold doesn't wait for you to get ready." Walter got out of the car. The air smelled like pine resin and wet earth and something else. Something old and specific that he recognized from childhood but couldn't name. Rex jumped down beside him, stretched once and stood very still with his ears forward, reading the tree line. "Just us," Walter said. Rex looked at him, then looked back at the trees. Getting the front door open required his shoulder and more force than he'd expected from a man his age. But it gave eventually with a low groan. And the smell that came out was dust and mouse and old wood and his father's pipe tobacco, or the ghost of it. Faint enough that Walter thought he might have imagined it. He hadn't imagined it. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. The cast-iron stove in the corner was still there. The kitchen table, the one his father had made himself from a single slab of walnut, was still there, scarred and warped but whole. The two wooden chairs were still there. The iron bed frame in the back room. The hand pump at the kitchen sink that used to pull from the well behind the house. Walter crossed the floor slowly, testing each board before putting his weight down. Most of them held. A few near the window had gone soft, and he stepped around them. He worked the hand pump. It resisted, then coughed. Then, after several strokes, produced a trickle of brown water that cleared to rust, and then to something almost clear. The well still worked. He went back to the car and brought in what he had. A sleeping bag, 2 changes of clothes, a box of canned food, a cookpot, Rex's food and bowl, a flashlight, and a half-empty bottle of Jim Beam that he had been nursing since the courthouse. He set things down without organizing them. He sat in one of his father's chairs at his father's table, and he didn't move for a long time. Rex explored the house methodically. Every corner, every room, nose low to the floor, and then came and sat beside Walter's chair and leaned against his leg. Walter put his hand on the dog's head. Outside, the October wind moved through the pine trees, and the light went from gray to amber to dark. He didn't go back. That was the decision he made that first night, sitting in the dark with a candle he'd found in a kitchen drawer, and Rex breathing steadily at his feet. He was 64 years old. And the life he had tried to build in the city had been taken apart by people with briefcases and signatures. But this land, this 63 acres of Louisiana pine that his father had paid for and cleared and kept, this was still in the family trust. Walter had checked before he drove up. He had checked twice. It wasn't much. But it was something. He slept better that night than he had in 2 years. In the morning, he started working. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. It doesn't matter where in the world you are. I'd just like to know. The first week was about survival basics. Walter patched the worst of the porch with lumber he salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding at the edge of the south field. He rehung the screen door. He found the old axe in the barn and sharpened it and started building the woodpile back up, going out in the mornings while the air was still cold, and coming back with his arms full. His hands blistered, and then the blisters calloused over, and the work got easier. Rex stayed close but not underfoot. The dog had a way of being present without demanding anything, lying near wherever Walter was working, watching, occasionally lifting his head to track a sound in the trees that Walter couldn't hear. He was 4 years old, a German shepherd that Walter had adopted from a rescue operation in Shreveport. 3 years earlier, back when Marcus's marriage was already starting to show cracks, and Walter had found himself eating dinner alone most nights. The rescue coordinator had called Rex a difficult placement because he'd been with 3 families in 2 years. Too big, too serious, too much energy. Walter had taken one look at him through the kennel fence and recognized something. Out here, Rex wasn't difficult. Out here, Rex made perfect sense. By the second week, Walter had settled into a rhythm. Up before dawn, fire in the stove, Coffee heated in the cookpot. Real coffee, the only luxury he'd allowed himself when he drove into the town of Campti for supplies. Work until midday, eat something simple, rest for an hour, work again until the light failed. Evenings at the table with the candle, and whatever book he'd pulled from the shelf his father had left. Louis L'Amour, mostly, a few history books, one very old Bible with his mother's name written inside the front cover in her careful cursive. He was not happy. He wasn't sure happy was the right target, but he was occupied, and occupation turned out to be something he'd been missing for longer than he'd realized. Rex, meanwhile, had developed a habit. Every afternoon around 3 o'clock, the dog would rise from wherever he was resting and walk to the north edge of the property, to a place where the pines grew thick and a small creek ran through a shallow gully. He would stand at the edge of the gully and look across it, and then look back at Walter. Walter followed him the first time, thinking maybe the dog had spotted a deer. There was nothing across the gully except more pines and a dense stand of swayed saplings that had grown up in what might once have been a clearing. The second time, Walter crossed the gully and pushed through the saplings. There was a clearing, not large, maybe 40 feet across, and almost entirely reclaimed by brush and young trees. In the center of the clearing, nearly hidden under a decade's worth of pine needles and fallen branches, was a flat wooden door set into the ground. Walter stood there for a moment without moving. Rex sat beside him and waited. The door was about 4 feet square, framed in pressure-treated lumber that had held up better than it had any right to. There was a handle, a simple iron ring set into a board, and a padlock that had rusted partially open. Walter pulled at the lock and it gave on the second try, the shackle breaking off entirely where corrosion had eaten through it. He pulled the door open. The smell that came up was earth and metal and something dry. Not decay exactly, more like the inside of a sealed container. He shone the flashlight down. A wooden ladder, a dirt floor about 8 feet below. Shelves along both walls, and on the shelves, he climbed down. His father had been building this since at least the mid-1970s based on the dates on some of the canned goods. Though those had long since gone bad, what hadn't gone bad was more than Walter could inventory in one afternoon. Sealed metal containers of rice, beans, and salt, cases of water in heavy plastic containers, medical supplies, bandages, antiseptic, medications in sealed bottles, hand tools, lanterns and oil, ammunition in sealed military surplus cans, a shortwave radio, old but sealed in plastic wrap, maps, binders full of documents, property records, deeds, surveys going back to 1958. And in the back corner, under a canvas tarp that had kept out most of the moisture, 3 5-gallon buckets sealed with gaskets, labeled in his father's handwriting. Walter pried the first one open. Gold coins. Not a fortune. He wasn't naive enough to let himself calculate that yet, but enough. More than enough. He sat down on the dirt floor in the underground room his father had built in secret and never told anyone about. And he put his face in his hands, and he stayed that way for a while. Above him, through the open hatch, he could hear Rex pacing slowly around the perimeter of the clearing. He didn't tell anyone right away. That was instinct, and he trusted instinct. It had saved his life at least twice in places where the stakes for being wrong were considerably higher than this. He came back to the shelter every day for a week. He inventoried everything carefully, writing it down in a notebook he'd bought in Campti. He assessed what was usable, what needed to be replaced, what needed to be researched. He read through his father's property documents. Twice. The land was in the Briggs family trust, left to Walter as the surviving heir. The shelter was on Briggs' land. Everything in it had belonged to Earl Briggs, and now, by law, belonged to Walter. On a Tuesday afternoon in the third week, he drove into Campti and found a lawyer. He was sitting on the porch 2 weeks after that. The porch he had rebuilt, the boards solid under him, the sagging left corner now squared and braced. When the truck came down the dirt track, he recognized it before it stopped. A white Silverado, new, with chrome trim. His daughter-in-law's father drove a truck like that. He sat very still and watched it park. It was Renee who got out. She was dressed for somewhere else. Heeled boots, dark jeans, a jacket that belonged in a city. She looked at the farmhouse for a moment with an expression Walter couldn't read from where he was sitting. Rex stood up from his spot beside the chair. "Stay," Walter said quietly. Rex stayed. Renee picked her way across the yard, avoiding the muddier patches with small, careful steps. She stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked up at Walter. "I heard you were up here," she said. "That right," Walter said. "Not a question. Marcus told me." She glanced around the property, the cleared field, the repaired porch, the woodpile that now ran the full length of the lean-to. Something moved across her face. "You've been busy." "I have." She came up the steps without being invited. Walter didn't stand. "Walter." She sat in the other chair, his father's chair, the one he'd been careful not to use himself, and crossed her legs and looked at him directly. "I know things got complicated with the settlement. I know you feel like you lost something that wasn't fair." Walter said nothing. "But the fact is, this land, it's in the family trust, and Marcus is family. He has a claim here too. And the children." She paused, recalibrated. "The point is, there might be options here, for everyone. If this property has value, there are ways to structure things so that—" "How did you know this property had value?" Walter asked. She stopped. The question sat between them in the October air. "Marcus mentioned." "Marcus hasn't been here," Walter said. "Marcus hasn't called me in 4 months. And the only person I've spoken to about anything on this property is a lawyer in Campty. And she doesn't know you." Rennie's expression shifted. Only slightly, but Walter had spent 3 decades reading people in conditions that didn't allow for mistakes. "I'm just saying there might be." "The trust is clear," Walter said. "My father's attorney drew it up in 1987 and updated it in 2004. Sole surviving heir, that's me. The land is mine. What's on the land is mine." He looked at her steadily. "I had my lawyer check." She was thorough. Rennie looked at him for a long moment. "You were never easy to deal with," she said. The warmth was gone from her voice. "No," Walter agreed, "I wasn't." She stood. She smoothed her jacket. She walked back across the yard to the white truck with the chrome trim, and she got in, and she drove back down the dirt track until Walter couldn't hear the engine anymore. Rex sat back down. Walter reached over and scratched behind the dog's ears. "Good boy," he said. That was the end of it, legally. The lawyer sent 2 letters over the following month. One on behalf of Renee, and one that appeared to be from Marcus, though the signature didn't look like Marcus's, and Walter's attorney responded to both with the relevant sections of the trust document. And then the letters stopped. Winter came early to Calhoun Parish that year. The first hard frost hit in November, coating the pine needles white and freezing the creek in the gully solid. Walter had laid in enough wood by then, and the cast-iron stove heated the farmhouse well enough that he slept warm every night. He used some of what he'd found to repair the roof properly, hired 2 men from Campty who didn't ask too many questions and did good work. He ran electricity out from the county line. He got the hand pump replaced with a proper well pump. Small things, one at a time. He started to learn the land again, the way he had known it as a boy. Before Vietnam, before Baton Rouge, before all the noise of a life built for other people's approval. He learned which part of the South Field got light long enough to grow a garden. He learned where the deer moved at dawn. He learned that the creek in the gully ran clear in January if the rains had been good, and that it went brown by March, and that Rex preferred to drink from it anyway. Marcus called in December, not to talk about the letters. That wasn't mentioned. Just to call. The conversation was short and awkward in the way that conversations are when 2 people have let something go too long. When the words have to climb over silence just to be heard. But it was a call. Walter kept it brief and said goodbye without anger, which was more than he'd managed the last time. Maybe that was its own kind of progress. He wasn't sure. He had stopped expecting clean resolutions from complicated things. What he knew was this. When he walked the fence line in the mornings with Rex moving ahead of him through the frost-stiff grass, he felt something that had been missing for years. Not happiness exactly. He was too old and had seen too much to use that word carelessly. Something steadier than that. Something that didn't depend on a courtroom or a signature. Or whether someone who had once promised to be family actually kept that promise. He had come here with nothing. That was still mostly true. But the nothing had turned out to contain something, buried under pine needles and years, waiting, the way things his father built had a habit of doing. He thought about Earl Briggs sometimes, while he split wood in the cold mornings. His father had never explained himself much. He'd just done things, cleared land, built shelter, put away what was needed for hard times, and let the work speak. Walter had spent most of his adult life thinking that was a limitation, that a man who couldn't articulate what he was doing wasn't fully doing it. He understood now that he had been wrong about that, and that understanding felt like the most valuable thing he'd found on this land. Rex was sitting by the stove one evening in January, his chin on his paws, his eyes tracking the fire through the grate, the way dogs track things that interest them without requiring explanation. Walter was at the table with his notebook, writing down nothing in particular, just what the day had been, what he had done, what needed doing tomorrow. He looked at the dog for a long time. "You knew," he said. Rex's ears moved. "The first week, you kept going back there." Walter set down the pencil. "How'd you know something was there?" Rex looked at him with the calm, uncomplicated patience of an animal that has never found this question remotely interesting. Because the answer is obvious, and has always been obvious. And some things do not require words to be true. Walter picked up the pencil again. He wrote, "The work, the land, the dog who wouldn't give up on either one of us." Then he looked up at the frost-covered window, at the dark pine forest beyond it, at the 63 acres that his father had kept, and that the courts had not been able to take, and he thought, not for the first and not for the last, that sometimes what a man needs isn't a second chance so much as a first look at what he already had.